it's not, you know, thank you for hosting all these sessions with these amazing guests from South Africa. It really is really enlightening for the rest of us. But I think we're ready for our next session now. Mudassir, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Zahid, and thank you again, Nazir. I'd like to echo that. We've had some fantastic sessions this morning, and your session was very illuminating. It was wonderful to hear from Kanita, and it's lovely that a Muslim woman occupies such a high position in the South African media, and she clearly deserves it. I've ordered her book, and I'm looking forward to reading it, inshallah. Now, you are all listening to the Concordia Forum Distant Socializing sessions. This morning, you've heard from Keith Ellison, the first Muslim in the US Congress. You've heard from Yasmin Qureshi, the Shadow Minister for International Development. You've heard from Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. And just now you've heard from Kanita Hunter and Nazir Jamal. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our next speakers. We're now going to have an hour-long session moderated by Haroon Moghul, a well-known journalist, commentator, and someone who's been involved with Concordia for a very long time. And he will be speaking to Shaykh Yasir Qadhi, an Islamic scholar based in Texas, North America. I'm going to hand over to Haroon to introduce Shaykh Yasir properly, but I'm so excited to hear what both of you have to say, and thank you both for agreeing to do this. Over to you, Haroon. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is, as Mudassir said, Haroon Moghul. Ramadan Mubarak, wherever you are. I'm really honored and excited to be interviewing Shaykh Yasir Qadhi, whose bio I will share with you in just a moment. But before beginning, I wanted to thank Mudassir and Zahid and the Concordia team for putting together these events. I understand this is the 9th iteration of these programs, which is pretty remarkable. And I wanted to thank all of you for tuning in. You may see me from time to time sip at a coffee. That's because I'm not fasting. So before you freak out, just to let you know in advance. And now I wanted to introduce Shaykh Yasir Qadhi, who I'm sure all of you have heard of. He has a very impressive bio. In case you don't know his full bio, I'll let you know that he is the resident scholar of the East Plano Islamic Center. He's the Dean of the Islamic Seminary of America. He graduated with a bachelor's in science and chemical engineering from the University of Houston, after which he was accepted as a student at the Islamic University of Medina. He completed a diploma in Arabic, graduated with a BA from the College of Hadith in Islamic Sciences, and then completed a master's in Islamic theology from the College of Dawah. As if that was not enough, he returned to the United States and completed a PhD in religious studies from Yale. He's authored several books, published academic articles, appeared on numerous TV programs and stations. His videos and programs are among the most popular Islamic content in the English-speaking Islamic world. The format for today is I'm going to ask the Sheikh some questions and at the same time invite you to pose your own questions. At the bottom of your window, you'll see a little button that says chat. You can use that button to share questions. A little window will open up on the right side of your screen, and I'll select from those questions at random. But to begin with, I'll let you know I'm in New York City. I've been here alone for the last 8 or 9 weeks, so I wanted to ask the Sheikh where you are and who you're with during this lockdown.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I hope you guys can hear me, inshallah. I am in Plano, Dallas. I've been here, well, I just moved to Dallas around 9 months ago. And alhamdulillah, I thank Allah that I'm with my wife and 4 children and my parents who moved in 7 months ago. We didn't realize we'd be locked down. So we are, alhamdulillah, 8 people total, alhamdulillah, but we are isolated from everybody else. But yes, we are 8 people living in the house, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, that sounds really nice. So to start with, I thought we would ask you, given the lockdown and the fact that it's Ramadan, what does your day-to-day routine look like?
So my day-to-day routine, I have a daily session that I had no idea would become so popular. I mean, almost 100,000 people are watching daily. For an Islamic show, that's a big deal, actually, alhamdulillah. So it's a summary of 1/30th part of the Quran. And I posted on Facebook 3-4 days ago that this has been one of my most difficult episodes to prepare for, despite its simplicity. In fact, because of its simplicity, it is so difficult. I'm actually intentionally doing a very, very surface level summary of 1/30th, one juz every single day. And my typical style is a very in-depth analysis. We break down the verses, grammatical, syntax, tafsir, hadith. But this is totally different. In 35, 40 minutes, I have to summarize an entire juz of the Quran, and it's been very challenging. So believe it or not, I spend a solid 5 to 7 hours preparing for that half hour only. That's been my main focus. Along with that, there are some secondary projects that all of us have in the background. The back burner stuff. I have a book on Salafism coming out. It's been in the works for over 2 years. Alhamdulillah, it's almost done, but a little bit on the side. Other things happening on the side, alhamdulillah. So life goes on.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about the book later on in the conversation, so be ready for that one.
Okay.
I wanted to start with asking you a bigger question. You started doing a degree in the sciences, and then you end up doing a PhD at Yale. And now you're an Islamic scholar with, as you said, a platform that reaches in one program 100,000 people. So was this career something you always envisioned for yourself, or was it something that developed gradually over time?
Not at all. For those of you who were active in the Islamic world or the Islamic field, if you like, of preaching and teaching back in the early 90s, you will recall that there was no such thing as celebrity scholars back then. There was no such thing as, and I hate the term, but it is used, unfortunately. There was no such thing as famous academics. The people that I looked up to growing up were, Dr. Jamal Badawi and Imam Siraj Wahhaj, and we all knew that they weren't like ulama, they weren't trained, they were like preachers. There was nobody. I mean, Sheikh Hamza, with my utmost love and respect him, he just came back and started becoming popular. The year before I went to Medina, I just heard of a guy that had just come back, So the notion of a trained alim or sheikh who spoke English fluently, it really wasn't even known. So when I decided to go to Medina, I couldn't have had this notion of becoming a sheikh because there was no position to be filled, right? It wasn't there. I genuinely thought, and it's so naive in hindsight, but I genuinely thought that I'll go to Medina, study Islam, and come back and continue my chemical engineering career, because I'd already worked at Dow Chemical for a while. And so there was no notion of a full-time scholar, fluent in English. It just didn't exist. And Allah just opened one door after another, and then here I am now. It was definitely not even in my wildest dreams, something that I could have even imagined, much less had imagined. Just happened bit by bit.
I'm going to ask you a question that might sound a little bit weird, but I think it's a question that people could find of interest. You went from there to now becoming, I think The Economist did a special story on Islam in the West and described you as the most influential scholar of Islam in the West. Certainly you are among the most influential Islamic scholars in the world. Why do you think that is?
That's a difficult question. And I'm not answering this humbly or whatnot. I'm just being factual that to me, it demonstrates the vacuum that somebody like myself is sucked up to this position. Frankly, I'm just being honest here. It demonstrates the dearth of genuinely people who should be more qualified than I am. But because there's a vacuum, people that are not as qualified as they should be, I mean, myself, we are kind of sucked up to that level, and I don't deserve this. And I'm not saying this in a false, humble manner. I'm just being honest here. SubhanAllah, this is Allah's test and Allah's blessing at the same time. But I think one of the reasons is self-evident, and that is that we are the first generation to come of age and to go study professionally. And then in particular, in my case, I'm coming from, generally speaking, a privileged background, educated with a degree in engineering, upper middle class. I mean, that's, English is my mother language. Again, it's just, I just view it as Allah's qadr that we happen to be of that generation. Like I said, there wasn't a scholarly role model that I can look up to in the English-speaking world. And Allah has willed that the internet come out in this time frame as well. Again, when I went to study in Medina, if you guys remember Netscape, that was just out on the market. I remember at the university, we were just browsing on Netscape, right? There was no internet even. I didn't have email when I started University of Medina. There was no such thing as email. When I got email 1998 or something, 1999, so many years later. So it's just a combination of factors, fluency in English, the first generation to have born and raised in the West and then gone traditionally trained and come back. I mean, Sheikh Hamza is a few years older than I'm, obviously, like a decade or so older than I. Well, he's more than a decade older, but in terms of career-wise, he's a decade older than I am. So like we are of that generation. Imam Zayd as well, obviously much older to me age-wise, but again, in terms of coming of age da'wah-wise, we're all coming in roughly at the same time frame. And I think that's just, it just so happened that nothing intentional. You can't plan the era you're born into. You can't plan the technology that happens in your lifetime. Combination of factors. And maybe, I guess, one more combination would be the unique background. I mean, engineering, 10 years Medina, PhD at Yale. I mean, I say this with utmost humility in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's definitely a blessing that Allah has given, that I'm eternally grateful for, that combination that I did study here. I went overseas to one of the most elite and yes, conservative, but definitely also very rigorous seminaries in the entire world. And then to come back and have an Ivy League education, which really changed me as well, which I know you're going to talk about as well. Alhamdulillah, I think that's also a combination that is rather unique. So I thank Allah and I ask Allah for protection and sincerity. It's a very dangerous place to be in for a person's, self-spirituality, but that's between me and Allah.
So you have a lot of followers, but you have a lot of critics. I think, on several occasions, some of the statements you've made or positions you've taken have inspired a fair amount of controversy. Why do you think that is? Well,
firstly, the person who doesn't have critics isn't doing anything. I mean, let's just be honest here. Like, the only person who's going to be safe from critics is the person who stays locked up and does nothing in his house. And even then, his mom's going to criticize for not doing anything. You just can't protect yourself from critics. I'm not worried about critics. I'm concerned about criticism that is legitimate, or criticism that is life-threatening or socially threatening to me, which has also happened. Why do I generate a lot of critics? That's a good question. Ask my critics that question. But from my side, I try to be as open-minded as possible. I'm a human being. So when I genuinely make a mistake and I'm criticized for it, I try my best to own up to that mistake. I have made some egregious errors, especially the younger version of me. I've said things that I should not have said, and I've learned my lessons along the way. There are other things that I've said that obviously people will disagree with, and that's the nature of being in any field, especially in Islamic studies, especially as a scholar. There's no question that some of the views that I hold on theology, on Quran and Hadith, on social issues, on gender issues, on sexuality issues, I mean, obviously, I'm going to have a position. And no matter what position I take, there will be fans and there will be critics. So I need to decide my positions based upon what I feel is what Allah wants us to do to the best of my ability. And then I have to face the critics. There's nothing much to be said about that. Of course, there's a third category of critics as well, by the way. And these are the insincere folks, right? These are the people that distort and twist. These are the people that they nitpick. I mean, I've had critics from the far right, obviously Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer and all of them. I'm a prime target for them constantly. I've had death threats from the far right multiple times. I've had death threats from ISIS as well, who were very irritated at me criticizing them theologically. So yeah, I have a whole spectrum of critics, and Allah is the best protector.
So I do remember the ISIS fatwa. You were one of 20 scholars who were singled out as, apostates, as they put it. But you mentioned legitimate criticism. Can you give an example of an instance of legitimate criticism you feel you've grown from?
Well, obviously, one of the main sources, if you like, my life trajectory. Those who know very well that obviously 20 years ago, when I was at the University of Medina and coming out of the University of Medina, clearly I was a different person back then, and I was definitely a part of the mainstream Salafi movement, and I've owned up to that, and I am no longer a part of that movement, but I'm not going to dissociate the fact that I am who I am because of the stages I've been through. And so obviously at that phase of my life, I definitely uttered statements about other interpretations of Islam that were definitely uncalled for. That was the mainstream interpretation of my movement vis-a-vis those others. So I have statements about Shias, about Sufis, about other interpretations of Islam that obviously I've grown from, And the Salafi movement is known to characterize these other movements in such broad caricature language that I myself have obviously very publicly apologized for and moved on from. And other examples was, I mean, that's human nature. I mean, that's as you grow, you're going to change your views and opinions. And as I said, I try to own up for any genuine mistake that I've made and apologize and show that I've moved on from that.
So I wanted to just jump on something you said here. You mentioned you're writing a book on Salafism. You mentioned you came out of the Salafi movement, but you don't identify as a Salafi anymore. So what does that mean when you say you don't identify as a Salafi anymore?
So the movement obviously is different than the ideal, which is the case all the time in every single movement in the world, and in every single, I mean, whether it's capitalism or communism or socialism or liberalism or democracy or whatever the ism or whatever the version might be, you know, even Sufism. I mean, who gets to define what it is and what is a real Sufi? So you have quite a lot of tensions going on. So there are multiple facets to that question, and I could give multiple lectures, and I have been interviewed by former Salafis and by Salafi channels, so I've gone into more detail there. In a nutshell, let me just say that firstly, the ideal and the reality, as is always the case, is markedly different. And so what Sufis claim is Sufism and what Sufis practice, what Salafis claim is Salafism, what Salafis practice, right? What any movement claims is the ideal and what they practice, there's a marked difference. And I saw this even early on, even in the Medina phase, even when I was actually with the movement, you begin to feel a disconnect, like, hey, you're preaching this, but you're not living up to those ideals. That's one element, which is the case in all movements. But in my particular case, it's not just that. It is the realization, which was my specialty as the master's and the PhD level, which was a very difficult realization to come to, that pretty much every single interpretation of Islam is really an interpretation. Now, this is a very important point to say. I am not claiming all interpretations are equally valid. I'm not a perennialist. I'm not saying that anybody can just say anything they want to, they should have a free pass. Because frankly, I don't believe in that, and that would be nonsensical, because what's the purpose of revealing a faith if it's a free-for-all? At the same time, a structured sect, whether it is Salafism, whether it is Mu'tazilism, whether it is Sufism, anything that is structured, it obviously developed over time. It's not something that, you know, Allah himself is revealing or the Prophet himself is coming with. So you come to this realization academically, and therefore you do become more tolerant and broad-minded, and you kind of sort of just move on from carrying a card of a particular sect or ideology anymore. Having said that, I am still very committed to overall mainstream Islam, to the Quran as the book of Allah, to the Sunnah as the teachings of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So obviously at a personal level, I'm still trying to be a committed Muslim, but identifying with a particular strand or whatnot, I mean, I've kind of grown beyond that. That's the way that I phrase it.
So there's a question in the chat box. I don't know if you have it open, but Kamran Bukhari is asking, could you trace your intellectual evolution away from Salafism in terms of stages and the ideas that shaped your trajectory? I know that's a big question, but perhaps we can narrow it down and say, were there any particular instances or texts or encounters that might have moved you in the direction you moved in? So
my trajectory has been pretty much on the academic side. Like it wasn't, my PhD was about obviously Ibn Taymiyyah, but I mean, my master's is about early Sunni theology. And so I'm reading, no exaggeration, many dozens of classical books about Islamic theology written in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th Islamic, Hijri centuries. And it's reading those books that you come to realize the human development of these creeds. And at Yale, obviously, you continue that. This was something I did on my own. On the PhD was separate because that's Ibn Taymiyyah and reconciling reason and relation. But I always had a personal interest in this regard. And so just, doing my own research in this regard and reading about the evolution of Islamic theology, to me, that was one of the main issues. Obviously, there's no question that going to Yale helped in allowing me to see epistemology from a different paradigm. Let me put it that way. And this is something that does require a longer talk. My critics from within conservative Islam or ultra-Orthodox Islam, they slur me by saying, oh, this guy just went to Yale and was brainwashed. I mean, obviously, it's far more complicated than that. It's not that my professor spoon-fed me what to believe. The fact of the matter is, and I admire my professors, but I knew my religion better than they did. I knew my sources better than they did. I knew my text better than they did. But what happened at Yale was the introduction to Western thought, the contextualization, the source critical analysis that you are not taught in any Eastern madrasa. Obviously, Eastern madrasa training, you respect the books, you don't question the sources, you know, you're not taught to think critically. And obviously in the West, it's all about critical thinking. And in my analysis, there's got to be a little bit of both. I mean, we have to respect classical authority or else we wouldn't have a faith. We have to respect our earlier scholars, but that doesn't mean we don't question them. So there is that fine balance that there is no right answer. I'm showing what I believe to be right and everybody can have their interpretation. But bottom line is that I was exposed to a mode of thinking that made me realize that my previous mode of thinking had to be modified. And so I did this on my own, and what I have now is who I am. It's neither Eastern nor Western. You can't really, I'm clearly not purely a secular academic. I'm a faithful Muslim. I believe the Quran to be, you know, the book that Allah revealed. That's not something that you teach in academia. It's something you believe as a Muslim. At the same time, my views are no longer simplistically of any madrasa or any sect. I am far more critical of the school that I came out of, and frankly, of every ossified version of Islam. Every single, interpretation that is basically set in, whether it's Ghazalian, whether it's Ibn Taymiyyah, whether it's, whatever it might be, these are all human products, but that doesn't mean they're all equally valid. So again, you're asking very deep questions, Haroon, but I hope what I've said is at least somewhat clear. I can go into more detail, but it's up to you guys.
Yeah, I might push on that. I think you're bringing up a lot of questions, but I mean, maybe to pull back a little bit, the trajectory you take from Islamic University of Medina to Yale is probably not a very common one. I'm not really aware of many people who go from that seminary to that institution to do religious studies. Was there anything that sparked the decision why would you go to Yale?
There's only been one other graduate from Medina that's gone on to an Ivy League, and that's Dr. Muzammil Siddiqui. And he has been a mentor to me in many ways. And I do love and admire him immensely. Having said that, he went through a different time and phase. Like, he went to Harvard back in the early 70s. It was a very different world, and Islamic studies was very different back then. And also, he didn't really stay in academia. He just immediately became an imam. I stayed in academia, and I'm still attached to academia. I still present papers and write articles. And so in that sense, yes, I do think, I don't know of anybody else that's done this. As far as I know, it is unique. Why did I do that? Because in Medina, I realized I needed to broaden my horizons. While I was a master's student, I began to understand that there's a lot more that the world has to offer that I don't know. And I knew that the only way that I would do that is by literally diving into the deep end. There is no other way. You just have to walk into the lion's den. And therefore I did apply to all of the famous Ivy Leagues in Oxford and whatnot. And alhamdulillah, I got into more than one. And I chose Yale because of Professor Bovering, really. He was my main mentor over there. And he's a Jesuit priest. And so I found in him a kindred spirit. Like, he's a priest. He still is a priest, So he's a person who believed in his own version of Christianity, and he saw in me religiosity and liked it, and I saw in him religiosity and liked it. So that was one of my main reasons I chose Yale. And alhamdulillah, obviously, I believe it was divine providence, because it was the right environment for me. Now that I know the other institutions, not trying to diss any other one, but I'm very happy I graduated from Yale, and it really helped allow me to become who I am now.
We have two questions in the chat box. I'll start with the first one. I know we like to maybe label things, so I don't know how. You did mention mainstream Islam. You affiliated yourself with mainstream Islam. So this question is how you would describe yourself today. And I'm assuming. Yeah,
that's a difficult question. I mean, what are adjectives? They're all relative. I mean, any adjective you use, I use, you can criticize. I mean, overall, I respect the tradition that has evolved around the books of Hadith and Sunnah. So that's generic Sunnism. I definitely view the classical schools of Islamic law as having contributed so much in shaping our Islamic law of today that we cannot just divorce and dissociate from them, that we stand on giants. And therefore, at some level, others would see, again, what are labels? I mean, there are people that consider me to be liberal and sellout. There are people that consider me to be fundamentalist and fanatic. I mean, it's just a spectrum, it's a continuum. And where I am on the spectrum and where you are, that's how we relatively look at each other. So there are plenty of people, just log on right now today. I mean, there are critics on both sides of the aisle. There are people that consider me to be too fundamentalist and too backward and conservative. And there are people that are considered to be too quote unquote liberal and whatnot. These are all relative terms. In my personal analyses, I am understanding the human nature of our tradition, and I'm respecting that. And I'm trying to do my best to respect that tradition, not necessarily discard it because I don't believe in a radical reformation. It doesn't work that way. But at the same time, fine tune it where the tradition allows us to fine tune it. Allow Islam to be a healthy civilization in the modern world. Take into account the different dynamics. Take into account our situation in the Western world as minorities living in a type of governance that was unknown of hitherto, a liberal democracy. You know, so all of these things are cutting edge. They're novel. And while I understand that, you know, many movements want to go back to Al-Ghazali or Ibn Taymiyyah, my position is you're not going to be able to solve the problems of a modern America by quoting Ibn Taymiyyah or Ghazali. That doesn't mean we discard them. It means that, you know, if you're rooted in a whatever tradition, you have to push it forward. And I have a phrase that is pretty popular in the conservative circles. And that phrase is, my criticism of Salafis is that they only read Ibn Taymiyyah and they don't try to walk in the footsteps of Ibn Taymiyyah. What I mean by this is they suffice themselves to quoting the past. And I can say the same to Ash'aris and Sufis. They quote Ghazali, but they don't want to do what Ghazali has done, which is to rethink through. Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, I look up to them because they did for their time frames what needed to be done. They took their versions of a tradition and they pushed it forward. And they pushed it with so much force that people to this day are still riding the wave. And they don't understand that that was a wave that was started by medieval scholars. If you truly admire Ghazali, do what Ghazali did today. If you truly admire Ibn Taymiyyah, do what Ibn Taymiyyah did today, given the circumstances of today. And I do hope, and again, it's a sincere dua, I hope it doesn't come off as arrogance. I do hope that that's what I'm trying to do in my personal life. That's as somebody who's absorbed the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah and still has deep down inside a big soft spot for him, even though I don't blindly follow him anymore. I hope that I'm doing something that he might have done in our times, given the circumstances of our era.
So there's another question which builds a little bit on what you're saying from Mudassir. Do you think the process you went through is one that needs to be codified for Muslims in the West? And if so, how do you see that happening?
Definitely. I think that the Eastern Islamic training has a lot of pros and also a lot of cons. And there is no question that the Western academic training of Islam has a lot of cons and also a lot of pros. And notice which order I put both of them in. And so there is no question that there has to be a synthesis between that. And I've been wanting to do this for the longest time. And this is a project that is coming to fruition under the Islamic Seminary of America right now that you know, I'm the dean of. And this is a seminary where we intend to produce a new type of trained scholar, not your typical standard madrasa graduate, and definitely not your standard, you know, Western graduate as well. There is this healthy synthesis that is needed, and it is especially needed for the Western mindset. We have a lot of intellectual problems facing our tradition, the problems of our sources, the problems of the Quran and the codification of the Quran, the problems of hadith and preservation of hadith, the problems of, you know, modern issues that are not discussed in our classical theological textbooks. And we don't have trained scholars to take this on. We have one of two extremes. We have the traditional scholars who simply problematize, hereticize is a better word, not anathematize, but to hereticize any type of thinking outside the box. How dare you question this? How dare you do that? And then we have the exact opposite, which is pretty much a person who doesn't quite have the faithful attachment to the book of Allah that needs to be. He doesn't have the spiritual attachment to our Prophet ﷺ. And I think that's a very important part of being a Muslim. I mean, at the bare minimum, there has to be a belief that our Creator revealed the book and sent a prophet. I mean, if you don't have that, I just don't see that as being a faithful Muslim if you don't have that line. So you have to have this healthy synthesis where we're willing to question, but within the confines of that respect that is necessary to our Lord and to our Prophet. And I think that that's what I'm trying to do at the Islamic Seminary of America.
So I want to push on that point a little bit. A couple of weeks ago, a fellow Concordian, Wajahat Ali, who I'm sure you're familiar with his work, interviewed Sheikh Hamza. And, you know, they talked about the pandemic, they talked about some of the outlines of Islam, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I just would like to know what you think of this. Sheikh Hamza said that, and I'm hoping I'm quoting him correctly, so correct me if I'm wrong. He said that of the four madhahib, the majority opinion is that if someone doesn't pray, they're not Muslim. And, you know, we live in a time where we see an increased identification among many Muslims as culturally Muslim, ethnically Muslim, secular Muslim, so on and so forth. I mean, I know there's a tendency to want to be expansive, but there's also, as you put it, you know, a need to have certain boundaries. So where would you put those boundaries?
Interesting. I would be very curious if you went back and checked it. I didn't watch the interview. Technically speaking, the majority position is that the one who doesn't pray is a Muslim. It's only the Hanbalis, and Imam Ahmad and Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Qayyim has a book, he wrote a 200-page book, The Verdict of the One Who Abandons the Prayer, Hukum Tariq as-Salah, in which he presents a whole array of evidences to prove that the one who doesn't pray cannot be considered a Muslim. But Imam Shafi'i, others, the majority position is that they're nominally a Muslim, i.e. they're a fasiq or a sinner. But nonetheless, I mean, the issue of whether they're Muslim or not, that's a theological one. As Ibn Taymiyyah himself points out, and others, who actually he felt, or he preached that those who don't pray are not Muslim. At the same time, he said, in the history of Islam, no one's ever been executed for not praying. Like, there's a reality that is different than theory once again. So theory is one thing and reality is another. But your question is broader than that. You talk about a group of people, what's a way to call them? I mean, I guess they identify civilizationally with Islam, primarily because they've been born into the faith or married into the faith. So they identify with civilizational aspects, their heritage, their names, the cultures they've been born into, the symbolic Eids that they prayed growing up. I mean, they're not, and yet at the same time, you know, from the perspective of the, you know, 5-time praying, mosque-going, you know, Hafiz al-Quran type of Muslim, you know, these people are just far out. You know, you don't see them in the mosques, you don't see them in the rituals, they can barely recite the Quran, if even they know the Quran at all by heart, any portion of the Quran. So I understand from an anthropological point of view that there are going to be such people. I understand that they genuinely have an attachment to the faith. And I understand the theological conundrum as well, because I come from that trained tradition of theology and of Islamic, you know, training, where we are told, and of course there's an element of truth here, because in the end of the day, what defines a Muslim? No scholar in the history of Islam ever said self-identity, because that's ridiculous. I mean, there has to be, I mean, that's ridiculous from the perspective of trained scholars, obviously. From an anthropological perspective, that's not ridiculous. But from the perspective of those who identify with the tradition, by definition, every definition has to have a definition, right? By definition, when you say you're a Muslim, there's got to be some definition of what that is. And that is why every single sect, without exception, had its definition. A lot of times those definitions overlapped, and a lot of times they were mutually contradictory, but they offered some definition. Now, from my perspective, you know, that's a very interesting question, and I don't mind discussing it in theology classes, but I also have to deal with the reality that there are lots of Muslims in America, I meet them all the time, who identify as Muslims, again, from a civilizational perspective, and deep down inside, I know that they love Islam as a faith, and I know that they want to defend Muslims as a civilization, as a civil rights issue. And I know as well that they don't pray, and they don't they don't even fast. I mean, I know quite a lot of people like that they're born into Muslim families and they're second, third generation Muslims, and there's zero ritual attachment to the faith. And that is a problem from a religious paradigm. And I really don't know what to do, because some of these people are some of the most, the greatest allies we can have. They're great people. I don't want to mention names, but obviously some of these people are really great allies that they've done so much for their community. I just have to shrug my shoulders and say Allah's going to decide on the Day of Judgment. And that is a position I theologically hold, that we speak in generalities, we don't speak in specifics. That is a part of my theology that I preach and teach, that we do not assign heaven and hell. We do not assign God's anger and God's mercy on individuals. We can assign heaven and hell to generalities, i.e., those who are committed and pious shall gain paradise. Those who are mass murderers and evil shall go to hell. But if we were to meet an evil person, a mass murderer even, we cannot say to his face that you're guaranteed to go to hell. That's a standard Sunni theology. So I don't have an easy answer. And on a personal level, and I think also, Haroon, you know this as well from me, that anybody who gets to know me and we become friends, I have to say that I try my best to exude a positive vibe of religiosity, of inviting them to be a little bit more observant in the manner that is the most, without being preachy in a negative manner. And I think that's a part of, I frankly think that's a part of what our religion requires, that we should give this vibe of trying to guide others to a higher level of Islamic practice. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but if not.
No, it does. And actually it leads nicely to, we're getting a lot of questions, and I'm getting some questions that are being asked privately to me, which I think maybe people don't want to, for whatever reason, make their question public. But something that's come up a few times is something I wanted to touch on as well. And I know Mudassir wanted us to touch on. So I don't fast for medical reasons. I have pre-existing medical conditions. I'm sort of in a weird position right now in terms of the lockdown, because I don't really know when my life goes back to normal. And I know, I'm sure probably everyone on this call or this Zoom session, whatever you want to call it, probably has some level of anxiety right now. I'm sure you meet lots of Muslims who don't know what to make of a pandemic. So I would ask you how you respond to those anxieties or concerns. You talked about generalities versus specificities. Mm-hmm. What does this pandemic mean to you personally from a theological point of view?
I will be very frank here, and I'm always very frank. And one thing nobody can accuse me of, alhamdulillah, is to be double-faced. I speak my mind. I've given plenty of khutbahs and lectures in the last 7 weeks since the pandemic began, actually even before the pandemic began. And I gave a sermon, the khutbah, the first sermon of my masjid, to an empty masjid. I don't mind confessing to you that I was crying. You can't see it in the khutbah, but I was crying to speak to a masjid, one of the largest masjids in America. Over 2,000 people attend Jumu'ah. It's a massive complex here, East Plano. And to speak, and the halls are echoing with emptiness. I can hear, the echoes because it's empty. I'm speaking to an empty masjid. It's just being broadcast. The first Jumu'ah of the pandemic. And I'm just literally crying, but you can't see it in the video. But I think you can hear it in my voice. And I was very clear then, and I shall be clear now. How can you not see this as a divine wake-up call? I mean, the Quran is clear, and you cannot fail to see the injustices that have been perpetuated for too long and too publicly by too many people. I mean, the Quran is so explicit that Allah says that He never changes the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. In another verse, Allah says that Allah will never lift up a ni'mah, a blessing that He has bestowed upon a people until they do something to not deserve the blessing. I mean, this is very explicit. And the entire globe is now terrified. Global economies are crashing. Multi-billion-dollar corporations are filing for bankruptcy. All of us, we're not even shaking people's hands. I mean, the whole world is changing. And how can we fail to see that this is a divine wake-up call? The purpose, Islamically speaking, Quranically speaking, this transcends any sect. This is Quranic, and any person of faith, even actually Jewish and Christian and Muslim, any but person of faith is going to say the same thing, that the purpose of these types of communal pandemics or communal mini punishments not many, it is a major punishment here. The purpose is to act as a wake-up call so that we save ourselves from the individual punishments. A communal punishment does not mean every individual is guilty. It means for too long, too many people have done too many sins too publicly. That's what it means. For too long, too many people have done too many sins publicly. What are those sins? Well, where does one begin? The arrogance of feeling that you don't need God, heedlessness, irreligiosity and atheism, the cruelness of how we treat other human beings. I mean, for how long did we think that the pleas of the women who have been distressed, and you know what I mean by that, and the children that have been killed, and the refugees that have been told to drown, the innocent 2-year-old that drowned, for how long do you think their pleas will be ignored by God, by Allah? I mean, as a person of any faith, do you not understand that this is a wake-up call? Nature itself is complaining about mankind, what we've done to them. So at every level, theological and spiritual, and our harming of other people and our harming of nature, Allah is sending us a sign. The purpose of that sign is so that we rectify our ways. And therefore, we hope it is a blessing in disguise for the individuals. We hope that at an individual level, we improve ourselves, we return back to God, we become more religious, we give up our sins, we become more compassionate. That is the goal. And that's very clear from the Quran, by the way. This is not something that is a constructed later theology. It's quite clear from the Quran that that's a communal punishment because of something that we have done. And the purpose is that we return back to God. Again, it's very Quranic. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتُوبُونَ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَضَرَّعُونَ. Why don't they come back to me? Why don't they humbly submit to me? Why don't they repent to me? All of these are straight from the Quran. So I've been saying this quite publicly, and I am not ashamed to say, and I know it's politically incorrect. I know this, but it doesn't, whether it's politically incorrect or not, it doesn't change the reality that Allah has shown His supreme power over all of mankind in a manner that none of us could ever have expected or predicted. And that is truly something that should humble all of us.
So there's a few more questions I want to get to. I have some of my own questions, but I want to make sure that people's questions are also attended to. One of them that was sent to me privately, I don't want to get you in trouble, but I guess I will get you in trouble a little bit, has to do with, you mentioned earlier in the conversation, your position vis-a-vis other schools as interpretations, right? That every interpretation of Islam is an interpretation with degrees of fidelity to the sources.
Yes.
One of the questions I got is, what is your biggest critique of Sufi-leaning schools? I don't know if you want to take that question, put you on the spot.
I don't mind. No, actually, I don't really have a major problem with them anymore. I used to 20 years ago, but I really don't have any major problem with mainstream tasawwuf. I do have a personal issue with the more radical left-wing tasawwuf, which would be, you know, the crazy videos that we see of people. I think it's not befitting of a Muslim to engage in such rituals. It does make somewhat of a mockery. I mean, of course, the type of, you know, like even in the Christian religion, there are certain people that, you know, they will stand up and be ecstatic in their emotions. It's a human spectrum. You find it in Jewish mystical Kabbalah as well. And of course, that does, I don't appreciate that from a theological perspective, that I don't view that as being normative or encouraged, and it does give a bad name even to tasawwuf, in my opinion, but that's for them to decide. But I don't have any issue with mainstream tasawwuf at all. Like Ghazalian tasawwuf or Al-Muhasibi. I have a number of papers on Muhasibi. Qut al-Qulub of Talib al-Makki. I do theologically disagree with tasawwuf that goes to the level of considering God and man to be like one, which is wahdat al-wujud. I am against that theologically, and I leave the affair to Allah. I mean, I know they're in their own way sincere. I've read Hallaj and Ibn Arabi a little bit to know that deep down inside they had their sincerity. I don't agree with Hallaj and Ibn Arabi type of Sufism, but I have no problem whatsoever personally with Ghazalian mainstream Sufism. And I do have a strong problem with those versions of Sufism, which are very rare, but they do exist, that say that you don't have to follow the law anymore. You are basically, you know, antinomian is the technical term, where they say that we don't have to pray, we don't have to fast, we have reached a level of maqam that, and of course, even mainstream Sufis find that problematic. So I hope that answers your question. I don't have a problem with mainstream Sufism.
Okay. If I can just follow up on that, is there a reason why you don't affiliate with Sufism?
When you say affiliate, do you mean a tariqah? Because while I don't have a problem with the tariqah, I could never, ever hand my mind over to another person and say, here, you think for me and I'll just follow you. One thing about Salafism, which I'm no longer Salafi, but I still have it, like Salafism forced you to go back to the sources. Salafism, the one thing, is like a Protestant faith tradition. Like you don't just follow the priests, right? You go back to the text. You go and see what the evidence says. So I understand Tariqa Sufism, but I could never, ever just give my bay'ah to somebody. As for Ghazali and Sufism, I mean, I think that I benefit from it. So in my personal life, muraqabah and dhikr and tawakkul, I mean, all of the maqamat that are mentioned, I mean, I hope that I'm trying to apply them in my own way. So I hope that answers your question as well.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Thank you. We have a question from Zainab, which I think is really important. So I wanted to stop and take this question. Given the spiritual abuse which has been public in the Muslim community in the last few years, have you changed your approach to engaging with the community and or your peers who have been accused of this abuse? What would you say is the role of scholars, your peers, in dealing with these issues?
So that's a very multi-layered question. It honestly, and I'm not trying to dodge the question, it requires more time. This is one of the most sensitive topics of our era. And there's no way that I can do justice in 3 minutes or 5 minutes. And I don't want people to read into what I say, so I have to be very, very precise. The term spiritual abuse needs to be unpacked. There are different types of abuse. And certain types are far worse than others. When a particular person was accused of taking advantage of youngsters, I was at the forefront, I publicly posted, and I said there should be zero tolerance, like literally to the maximum of the law. When two consenting adults do something and the both of them are of age, then even if one has more quote unquote power than the other, but both were fully willing, that's not the same level, even if there's an element, I'm not denying. So again, there are shades here. I shouldn't say shades of gray, but I just did. There are shades here. It's a joke, by the way. I haven't seen or read the book, but obviously you're aware of what's going on. Okay, so there are shades of gray about this area, and not all cases are the same. And that is why I found it highly problematic when these types of cases were portrayed in the same light as the cases that involved abuse with minors. And we have, a number of scholars on a WhatsApp group that were involved across the spectrum in this regard. There's many types of abuse, many types of things that are not good. For example, there are a number of people who have secret marriages. And this is, by the way, not just sheikhs. I mean, general, men that have money or even men that don't have money. They sometimes, when they get married, and they don't tell their wives. To have a nikah done privately and secretly with the witnesses, but you don't tell your first wife or even society, that is definitely unsavory. And that's definitely not befitting a person of knowledge. But you just cannot put that in the same category as an imam molesting a child, for example. And I find that a lot of people, in their anger, they just want to lump it all together. So that's one area. Another example is an example I gave of two consenting adults, where two people were flirting with one another. It's clear it's mutual attraction. It's clear that they're going back and forth, and then this ends up in something that shouldn't happen. And once again, okay, that's definitely not right. And that's definitely not becoming, especially of a person of knowledge. But at the same time, you cannot, where does one draw the line between a private sin versus a public sin? What if it was a two-way street? So again, this is such an emotionally charged issue, which is one of the reasons why I've taken a back step for the time being, because we need to develop a full strategy. We need to be brave enough to categorize offenses. And we do need a higher body of clergy to deal within, like we don't have official clergy, but still people need to trust other community members. And the only way we can do this is by having a police force within, a police force metaphorically, obviously. We need to have internal checks and balances, and we don't have one as of yet, sadly. I don't know what else to say. I am definitely a huge critic of actual abuse, but I must say that some of what people consider abuse, and in particular secret marriages, which is unsavory, and I have advised people that I know that have this to not do this. But I have to be technically correct that no matter how unsavory and makruh and sad I am that somebody's doing that, you know, it's not something that is in the same category as a'udhu billah, molesting a child, for example, right? And so my point is that this whole issue of abuse, we need to be brave enough to talk about this without fear of a backlash. Because what happened was, and this happened with me as well, that when you try to bring up these nuances, people just lump you together with, oh, you're defending the clique, you're defending the crew. No, we're not. We are categorizing crimes here. We're categorizing things that might be just on the beginning spectrum of unsavory or criminal versus all the way down to child molestation. It's a very wide spectrum. And all we're asking for is the maturity to have that nuanced discussion of what falls where on the spectrum. And by the way, it's not just us doing this. Look at the Me Too movement. And again, I hate bringing this up, but was that guy, that Desi guy, the Aziz, whatever, I mean, something happened with him as well, like a huge discussion erupted, the comedian, whatever. Like, was it really abuse? Yeah, that guy, yeah. I mean, was it really abuse or was it not? I mean, the whole discussion, like, where does it go? So it's not just us who is discussing this. Others are discussing it as well. But what I feel is that this topic has become so taboo. It's become so charged that a calm, frank conversation and back and forth becomes almost impossible. So I've just taken a step back for the time being, and I ask Allah to protect me and to protect my immediate family and loved ones and my immediate colleagues and friends that I know. If I were to know of anything like this amongst them, I personally would get involved, and I have gotten involved, by the way, amongst people that I know that they're doing things that I think are not the best to do, and Allah knows best.
So given, I mean, you drew attention to Aziz Ansari, to the Me Too movement. I mean, right now we have this conversation happening around Joe Biden. I won't ask you to comment on this nationally, but in terms of how Muslim communities are responding to the issues that are in many cases finally being raised, or women who are finally being heard, how do you think the Muslim community is responding to this? I mean, if you were to score us or grade us.
I mean, overall, I'm very happy, to be honest, because, I mean, I have two daughters. I don't have a sister. I didn't grow up with other women in the house, but I have two daughters. And honestly, I mean, just the thought of all that's happening in the world. And it was a big wake-up call for me when I first began preaching Islam, like 15 years ago, full-time, and giving lectures and durus and halaqat and giving khutbahs all over. It was a huge wake-up call to me to have sisters come up to me and tell me of abuse that happened to them. And I did not realize it was so rampant. I just had no clue that it was just so rampant, molestation and taboo issues of this nature. And so I think it did impact me on a personal level, that I've given a number of khutbahs and talks about this. Obviously, I haven't done enough. Nobody's done enough. But overall, I am very sympathetic to the reality that there is far too much abuse going on within our culture. And especially, a'udhu billah, and this is all anecdotal, I don't have surveys, but from what I have been told by sisters that come to my lectures and classes, a'udhu billah, most of it is from family members and close friends. And that really is painful. And it's made me terrified for my own daughters. I mean, astaghfirullah, I've never allowed them to sleep over anybody's house. I mean, I'm just so protective of them because of what I've heard of what's happening in the society, So I am very happy that this has come to the forefront. That having been said, there is the other awkward, as I said, a conversation that, okay, what constitutes abuse? So we have to balance between genuine abuse versus a private sin versus an indiscretion versus something that is against the ideal. So there is that spectrum, but I'm happy that the conversation has begun. Because I know one thing, when I was growing up, nobody spoke about this at all. In the 80s and 90s, this was complete taboo. You never heard of a case at all. So the fact that we're having this conversation is very good, but I think we need to now get to a level of maturity where we are brave enough to tackle the actual issues and what constitutes a public crime that should be exposed and what constitutes something which, okay, it wasn't good, but it was a one-off mistake and may Allah forgive. So these are questions that need to and conversations that need to happen. And overall, I'm happy we're heading in that direction.
So there's a bunch of questions coming in, and I had some of my own questions. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to give people the chance to ask their own questions as well. You know, one of the questions that came up, and you know, we touched a little bit on the pandemic. So actually, you know what, I want to take this question that just popped up because it is building on what we've been talking about. Saba wrote, you were right in that there are varying degrees of abuse, including child abuse is particularly egregious, but even when there are two consenting adults, when you are a spiritual leader, there's an automatic level of power and hierarchy that is very, very problematic. So it's problematic to compare various levels of abuse. It is all problematic and should be seriously condemned. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Again, you're getting into this topic that is very charged. It is levels of abuse. You're saying it's problematic to compare. I have had cases, again, I'm looking at actual cases. People have come to me from their imam leaders and whatnot, and it's not all the same. Is the slightest abuse the same as the worst abuse? How can we not differentiate between that? I don't understand when, and again, I think grooming a young lady, which happened in one case, a young lady was groomed by a sheikh for literally a decade. A'udhu billah, that, I mean, throw him in jail and lock the, and take the keys and lock him. I mean, that's versus another case happened where, and again, I know this because again, they came to me. This is something I know of where a lady, you know, was very much interested in a particular sheikh, and she's texting him constantly and going to his office constantly and literally offering him. So doesn't justify at all, but she's in her 40s and he's in his late 40s, and you know, she's not like a 5-7-year-old girl or 10-year-old girl. And eventually, yes, a slip happens, and all of this evidence is now in front of us that, you know, the sheikh admits that I made a mistake. I ask Allah's forgiveness, but hey, I mean, you know, it wasn't like I wasn't going after her, and then all the evidence is there. She even admits to this. So is there no room for conversation of a spectrum here? If that is your view, I respect your view. I respectfully disagree, and that's all I'll say. There is a spectrum, and we have to be brave enough to talk about this spectrum that doesn't justify any sin. But at what point do we expose and go after? At what point do we criminalize? At what point do we bar somebody from being an imam for the rest of his life? I mean, again, it's scary for me as well, and all of us, and all of women as well. Like, is one mistake enough to khalas make everything haram for us? I mean, what if I flirt, a'udhu billah, with a lady, or I look at her with lust? What does that mean then? That khalas, I'm no longer qualified to give a talk? So where do we draw this line? And again, I don't have the answers right now, but I humbly, respectfully say that there must be the admittance of a spectrum, some of which abuse is far worse than others. Some is criminal. You're going to go to jail, and you should go to jail. And some is not criminal. Consensual sex between two adults that are flirting with one another is not criminal in this country. It is criminal in our Sharia. And so, yes, we will then look at that. But anyway, I don't know what to say, Haroon. This is a emotionally charged topic, and I wasn't prepared to talk about this, but I do say that I understand some people find it problematic to speak of a spectrum, but the law and common sense and our Sharia all say that there is a spectrum, and that's all I can say.
Okay, so there's a number of questions that are coming up, and I think the comments are really valuable. I'm glad people are having a conversation, and I hope this is an ongoing conversation. But since we have a few minutes left, there was a question that came up several times that I wanted to also give attention to, which was a number of people. Some said, you know, openly, and others privately to me that, you know, in the face of the pandemic, they're feeling a loss of hope and even despair, and, you know, suggestions or intimations of what I would say, you know, we would define as, you know, maybe not mental illness, but certainly symptoms of depression, so on and so forth. What would you say to someone in that kind of situation who's really struggling mentally, psychologically with what's happening?
So obviously you're coming to me as a person on the spiritual side of things. Anybody who needs actual help and counseling and therapy should go do that on the counseling side of things. That's a separate arena altogether. As a person who's talking about Quran and Sunnah, my advice would be quite very clear, and that is that لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah never puts us in a situation that He knows we're going to fail. that whatever situation we are in, that Allah knows we have the capacity to pass it. We have the tools to pass it. Also, the famous scholar Ibn Hajar wrote an 800-page book, by the way, about pandemics. It's the largest book ever written in Islamic history about pandemics. He lost 3 daughters himself when the pandemic hit Cairo. And so that grief, he channeled it, he motivated it, he used it as a motivation to write 800 pages of expertise about this. And he writes in that book that the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith in Bukhari that the one who is patient at the time of a pandemic and accepts that everything that happens at the will of Allah, and he has that stoic, patience and trust in Allah, that he shall get the reward of a martyr. And Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar remarks, and he says, notice that the Prophet ﷺ didn't say if he dies, he's going to get the reward of the martyr. He simply said if he has the positive attitude, he has that trust in Allah, he knows that nothing happens except by Allah's will, that he shall get that reward, which means you can live through the pandemic and still be blessed with the rank of a martyr without actually having died in the pandemic. So that's like positive news. Like we can get the best of both worlds. We can get the blessings of being a martyr in the eyes of God, and we can still live a good life in this world as well, hopefully for another few decades or whatnot. So I would simply say that we need to make the best of our situation, and that within every single calamity, there is the potential for us to convert that calamity to a blessing, and a potential for us to make the best of that by being our best personally with our Lord and Creator, and by giving unto society. That's all what Islam is about. Being good with Allah personally in the rituals, and then giving back to society with your kindness and compassion. If you're able to do that, you will come out a victor and a winner wherever you are.
Thank you very much. I wanted to thank all of you for listening in. Sheikh, I wanted to thank you for answering all these questions very frankly and honestly. I appreciate that. I know I apologize to folks who had questions. There were a lot of questions. Many of them were great questions. I couldn't get to them, but I hope I did justice to what people were asking and concerned about. Mudassir, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Haroon, for moderating this so deftly, and thank you, Shaykh Yasir. This was truly fascinating. It's so much refreshing to hear you in this format. And I hope, inshallah, that we can continue this in person at an actual Concordia Forum one of these days, inshallah.
Inshallah. Pleasure was mine. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Concordia Forum Distant Socializing. We've just been hearing from Shaykh Yasir Qadhi, widely considered to be one of the most influential Muslim scholars in the United States, moderated by our dear Haroon Moghul. We're now going to move on to our next session, which will be with Angela Rayner. Angela Rayner, of course, doesn't need much of an introduction. She's the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Joining her and moderating the conversation with her